I found a photograph from 1858, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, construction just beginning. What stopped me wasn't the building, it was the foundation. Over 250,000 square feet of hand-cut sandstone, already in place in what was then frontier territory. I kept trying to hold that number in my head. Who quarried it? How it got there? How long it took before a single wall went up? The building was designed to house 250 psychiatric patients. I couldn't make those two things sit together comfortably. That scale of craftsmanship, that quality of stonework for 250 patients in Western Virginia in 1858. So I started looking at others. Kirkbride buildings across Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, the Oregon State Hospital, Danvers State. I pulled up photograph after photograph, expecting the Trans-Allegheny to be an outlier. It wasn't. These weren't institutional buildings. They were the kind of architecture you build when you're trying to say something. The scale of a university, the permanence of a government building, the detail of a cathedral, built for populations that had no political voice, no advocates, no one to demand that kind of investment on their behalf. That's what I couldn't get past. Not just the craftsmanship. The mismatch between who these buildings were supposedly built for and what it would have actually taken to build them. The reform movement has a clear historical record. Dorothea Dix spent years documenting the conditions mentally ill people were kept in. Jails, poorhouses, cages, and private homes. She testified before state legislatures. She named specific facilities, specific abuses. The campaign was real, and the response was real. States built asylums. Between 1850 and 1890, nearly every state in the Union built at least one. Many built several. The Kirkbride plan became the architectural standard, long wings radiating from a central block, designed so patients would have light, air, and structured routine. The theory was that environment itself could heal. I read all of this and it held together. Reformers identified a problem, proposed a solution, convinced legislatures to fund it. That's how policy change works. Then I started looking at what these buildings actually cost. What it would have taken to quarry and transport that much stone. To install that ironwork. To build at that scale, in those locations, in that compressed window. And I started wondering who exactly was doing the accounting. The reform story explains why these buildings got built. It doesn't fully explain how. Those are different questions, and I'd been treating them as the same one. In 1850, roughly 2,500 people were confined in asylums across America. By 1890, that number was over 75,000. I kept running that math. The U.S. population roughly doubled in those 40 years. If institutionalization had just tracked population growth, you'd expect maybe 5,000 by 1890. Instead, it was 15 times that. I looked for the explanation in the standard places. Better diagnosis. As understanding of mental illness improved, people who'd previously gone unrecognized got identified and treated. Industrialization, creating new psychological pressures. Immigration, bringing populations unfamiliar with American social norms, leading to more frequent diagnoses. I read those explanations carefully. Some of them account for some of the growth. None of them account for 3,000%. That number kept stopping me. A genuine epidemic would show up in other ways: mortality records, family accounts, literary documentation of widespread psychological breakdown. I went looking for that corroborating evidence. It wasn't there in the proportions, the numbers required. So I went back to the records themselves, started looking at who actually got committed during this period, what the intake documents said, what diagnoses were driving the boom. The records are inconsistent and incomplete. A lot didn't survive, but enough did to show something I hadn't expected. The most common diagnosis wasn't violent mania, wasn't severe psychosis, wasn't anything that would obviously require removing someone from society. I want to be careful here because the records are genuinely patchy, but the pattern in what survives is hard to ignore. The diagnostic categories stopped me for a long time. Melancholia, moral insanity, religious excitement, masturbation, novel reading. These weren't edge cases. They were among the most common reasons for commitment during this period. I found actual intake records. Disappointed affection, gathering property, bad whiskey, a woman committed for excessive sadness after losing a child, another for joining a new church. I kept reading these, expecting to find the medical reasoning underneath. The clinical logic that would explain why these categories made sense at the time. I didn't find it. What I found looked less like medicine and more like a filing system. Categories elastic enough to process almost anyone whose behavior, beliefs, or circumstances made them inconvenient to someone with the authority to commit them. That observation on its own isn't new. Historians have documented the abuses of this period. What bothered me was the scale. You don't build 250,000 square feet of hand-cut sandstone in frontier territory to process a few inconvenient people. You build that for volume. And the volume was there. 2,500 people in 1850, 75,000 by 1890. Then I noticed the dates again. The asylum boom runs roughly 1850 to 1890. The major urban fires cluster in the 1870s. The World's Fairs start appearing in the 1890s. The buried ground floors get documented across the same decades. I'd been treating these as separate research threads. Looking at the dates laid out together, they stopped feeling separate. And then I looked more carefully at the buildings themselves. The Trans-Allegheny Asylum was designed to house 250 patients. It's 250,000 square feet. I did that math several times. 1,000 square feet per person, more than most modern houses. I kept looking for the number I was misreading, the square footage that accounted for it. The Kirkbride explanation covers some of it. Wide corridors for ventilation, separation of patient classifications, workshops, staff housing, administrative space. It doesn't cover a ballroom, a library with vaulted ceilings, a conservatory, a chapel with elaborate stained glass. These weren't added later. They were in the original construction plans. The moral treatment philosophy has an answer for this too. Beautiful spaces promote healing. Dignity matters. Architecture is therapy. I read that explanation and I understand the logic. What I couldn't reconcile was the craftsmanship. Hand-cut sandstone. Elaborate ironwork. The kind of detail you put into a building when you expect people to look at it for generations. When you're building something meant to be seen. 250 patients in Frontier, West Virginia in 1858 weren't a public audience. I started going back through the photographs looking for a building that felt sized and detailed for what it was supposedly built to do. I kept finding buildings that felt sized and detailed for something else, repurposed into psychiatric institutions somewhere along the way. I can't prove that. But the feeling got harder to dismiss. The more buildings I looked at. Danvers State sat on top of a hill overlooking the town. Gothic spires, elaborate brickwork in patterns that served no structural function, visible for miles. The main building was over 1,500 feet long, designed for a few hundred patients. The Athens Lunatic Asylum in Ohio cost $1.3 million to build in 1874. I ran that through an inflation calculator, roughly $35 million today, for 572 patients. That's over $60,000 per patient in construction costs alone. A working-class house in the 1870s cost around $800 to build. These asylums were spending the equivalent of 80 houses per patient. I sat with those numbers for a long time. The question I kept coming back to wasn't why they were so expensive. It was why that level of investment made sense to the people authorizing it. State legislatures don't spend 80 houses per patient on facilities for people with no political voice unless something else is driving the decision. One possibility, the buildings already existed, not built as asylums, but designated as asylums, structures that had served some other purpose, then reassigned when that purpose ended or disappeared from the record. That would explain the architecture. You don't build Gothic spires for ventilation. It would explain the cost because you're not really building, you're converting. And it would explain why so many of these massive structures appear in the same 40-year window. It would also explain the patient boom differently. Not a sudden epidemic. Buildings that needed to be filled to justify their continued existence. I can't prove that. But the cost numbers don't make sense under the official explanation either. And I haven't found anyone who's seriously tried to account for them. Buildings appearing too quickly with too much architectural sophistication for brand new institutional construction in Frontier, or small-town locations, diagnostic categories so broad they could encompass almost anyone, commitment records that read more like social control than medical treatment, and timing that overlaps precisely with other major institutional restructuring across the same decades. There's something else worth examining. The people who were institutionalized during this period, who were they? Where did they come from? What happened to them? The records are fragmentary, but enough survives to show patterns. I started going through intake ledgers from multiple institutions, page after page of handwritten entries, column after column listing names, ages, supposed diagnoses, and then the family information section. What stayed with me was the repetition. Entry after entry, the same phrases, no known relatives, no verified address, unknown origin, sometimes just a dash in the family column, sometimes the word none. I found myself counting how many times those phrases appeared on a single page, more than half, sometimes more than 3/4. A significant portion of institutionalized patients had no recorded family connections. They simply appeared in the system. No documentation of where they came from, no history prior to the moment they were committed. Immigration is the standard explanation. People arriving from other countries without established community ties, struggling with language and cultural adjustment, ending up institutionalized when they couldn't integrate. That accounts for some, but the numbers don't match. Census records from this period show asylum populations that don't correspond to the demographics of surrounding communities. Rural asylums in predominantly English and German areas, showing patient rosters with large percentages marked unknown origin. Urban asylums with patient populations that don't reflect the immigrant communities in those cities. I kept thinking about the contrast. These palace-like buildings with their grand staircases and stained glass, and inside them, hundreds of people with no names in the records, no families, no verified identities, just entries in a ledger. The architecture was designed to make a statement about dignity and humanity, but the record-keeping treated the people inside as numbers. And what happened to them? Asylum records show mortality rates of 15 to 20% annually in some institutions, significantly higher than general population mortality. Over 40 years, hundreds of thousands of people entered these institutions. A substantial percentage died there, without documented families, without verified identities, without anyone outside the system who could confirm who they were or where they came from. The burial grounds. Most large asylums maintained their own cemeteries. Many still exist. I found photographs of these graveyards. Thousands of graves, row after row stretching across hillsides. The Willard Asylum Cemetery in New York holds over 5,700 graves, most marked with nothing but numbers carved into small stones, no names, no dates beyond the year of death, just numbers, 856, 1203, 2547, corresponding to institutional records that in many cases no longer exist. I stood looking at one photograph from a Pennsylvania asylum cemetery for a long time, hundreds of numbered stones visible in the frame, and you could tell there were hundreds more beyond the edge of the photograph. The Gothic asylum building visible in the background on the hill, all that architectural grandeur, all that expense, all those ballrooms and stained glass windows and hand-carved stonework. And in front of it, stretching down the hillside, people buried as numbers, their identities gone, not lost accidentally, but never preserved in the first place. That's what I keep coming back to. These weren't people whose records were lost in a fire or flood. They were people who were never properly documented to begin with. The system that spent fortunes on architecture apparently couldn't be bothered to record who these people actually were. That's not just a health crisis. That's an identity crisis, a documentation crisis, on a scale that starts to feel deliberate. I kept coming back to the architectural question because it's the most visible evidence. These buildings are still standing. You can visit them, the ones that haven't been demolished. You can walk through the spaces and see for yourself whether they feel like structures purpose-built for psychiatric care or whether they feel like something else. Many have been abandoned for decades. The Kirkbride buildings, once considered the pinnacle of humane institutional design, fell out of favor in the mid-20th century. De-institutionalization movements emptied them. Most were closed by the 1980s and 1990s. A few have been converted to other uses: condominiums, office buildings, college dormitories. Many sit empty, too expensive to maintain, and too structurally complex to repurpose. And inside them, walking through the remains, you find things that don't quite fit the institutional narrative. Elaborate woodwork in patient wards, hand-painted ceiling murals, stained glass windows too ornate for hospital corridors, ballrooms with sprung floors designed for dancing. These weren't added later, they're original construction. The official history acknowledges these features but frames them as part of the moral treatment approach. Beauty is therapy. I tried to make that work. Progressive reformers in the 1850s and 1860s, in the middle of rapid industrialization and urban expansion, deciding to spend enormous state budgets building palace-like structures for people they could have simply warehoused in much cheaper facilities. Doing this not just once as an experiment, but repeatedly, in state after state, following architectural plans that required extraordinary expense and craftsmanship. It's possible. Reform movements have driven expensive public works projects. Architecture has been used as social statement. But when you map which states built these asylums, and when you look at the locations, often in small towns or rural areas, rather than major cities, when you examine the speed of construction and the sophistication of the architecture, the patterns start suggesting something different. Not buildings constructed because reformers demanded humane treatment. Buildings that already existed and were repurposed when their original function ended or was erased from the official record. And the patient boom? Not an epidemic of mental illness. A repopulation of existing institutional spaces with people who needed to be removed from visibility, people without documentation, people whose identities were either lost or deliberately obscured. The records that would settle this are incomplete. Not uniformly incomplete. Incomplete in specific ways. Financial documentation, patient intake records from the 1850s and 1860s, detailed treatment histories, the kinds of records state institutions receiving public funding should have maintained as standard procedure. The gaps aren't random. They cluster around the questions I was asking. I spent weeks looking for research that examines this as a single phenomenon. I found detailed studies of individual asylums, architectural histories, philosophy of treatment analyses. What I didn't find was anyone asking why the same pattern appeared everywhere at once. Same architectural principles, same cost scale, same diagnostic categories, same 40-year window across regions with completely different economies and political structures. That's a strange absence. The individual pieces have been studied carefully. The shape they form together hasn't been. Danvers State was demolished in 2007. I found this out while I was researching it, looking for records, trying to find someone who'd examined the original construction documents. The patient wings are gone. The underground tunnel systems connecting the buildings are gone. The elaborate courtyards are gone. The center administration building got converted into apartments. The explanation is practical, and probably true, expensive to maintain, asbestos, lead, valuable real estate, all of that is real. But I kept thinking about the timing. The buildings are expensive and contaminated and sitting on valuable land, and they've been all of those things for decades. The demolitions accelerated in the late 1990s and 2000s, same window when digital archives started making this kind of research possible. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not sure it means anything, but I noticed it, and I couldn't unnotice it. With them goes physical evidence, the chance to examine the architecture in detail, to study the construction techniques and materials, to compare what was built with what the official plans claimed would be built. That evidence is vanishing faster than it's being documented. Once it's gone, we're left with just the official narrative and whatever incomplete records survived. I found a photograph of a building that looked like a palace. The numbers said 3,000% increase. The diagnoses said laziness and novel reading. The architectural costs said 80 houses per patient. The graves said thousands with no names. And I keep coming back to the same question. If these buildings weren't originally asylums, what were they before? What happened to whoever was there first? The buildings are coming down. The question gets harder to answer every year.